The dust swirled in golden eddies across the cemetery as Jackson Lawson knelt before the wooden cross marking his brother's grave, his calloused fingertips tracing the freshly carved letters. James Lawson, 1851, 1876. The setting sun cast long shadows across the small burial ground on the outskirts of Randsburg, California, turning the modest marker into a silhouette against the blazing orange sky. Jackson had come here every evening for the past 2 weeks, since the day they'd laid James in the ground after a gunfight that should never have happened. "I should have been there, Jamie," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I promised Pa I'd look after you, and I failed." His broad shoulders slumped beneath the weight of grief, his dark hat clutched in his hands. "You're not the only one talking to heaven," came a soft voice from behind him. Jackson turned, startled to find a young woman standing a few yards away, her simple black dress fluttering in the evening breeze. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a small hat, and her eyes, though red-rimmed from crying, held a steadiness that caught him off guard. "Miss Valentina," he acknowledged, rising quickly to his feet and dusting off his worn denim trousers. "I didn't hear you approach." "Please call me Emma," she said. "After all, we share the same sorrow now." Emma Valentina stepped closer, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of James's grave. Jackson knew her only vaguely. She had been his brother's sweetheart, a fact that had surprised many in town given her family's standing as merchants and James's reputation as a sometimes reckless cowhand. Their courtship had been brief but intense, cut tragically short by the bullet from an angry gambler's gun. "He spoke of you often," she said, her gaze fixed on the grave. "His big brother who could tame any horse and shoot the eye out of a hawk at 100 yards. Despite himself, Jackson felt a faint smile touch his lips. He exaggerated. "I missed plenty of hawks." A small laugh escaped her, quickly followed by a sob that she tried to stifle with her hand. Without thinking, Jackson offered his handkerchief, which she accepted with a grateful nod. "I come here every day," Emma confessed. "I talk to him, tell him about the town, the people, as if he's just away on a cattle drive and will be back soon to hear all the news." Jackson swallowed hard. "I do the same. Tell him I'm sorry mostly." "Sorry for what?" she asked, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. "I was supposed to meet him that night at the saloon. If I'd been there, maybe I could have stopped it. Or at least, he couldn't finish the thought." "Been shot alongside him?" Emma shook her head. "Then I'd be bringing twice as many flowers, Mr. Lawson, and the world would be twice as dark." The simple statement stunned him into silence. In the 2 weeks since James's death, no one had dared suggest that his survival might be anything but a cruel twist of fate. "The sun's nearly gone," he finally said, noticing the deepening twilight. "May I walk you back to town? It's not safe for a lady to be out alone." Emma nodded, and they began the half-mile trek back to Randsburg in companionable silence. The town had sprung up quickly after gold was discovered in the nearby hills in 1867. Though the initial rush had faded, enough mining operations continued to support a modest but growing community. Storekeepers like Emma's father had prospered, serving the needs of miners and ranchers alike. As they reached the edge of town, Emma paused. "My father doesn't know I come to the cemetery," she admitted. "He thinks I'm taking evening walks for my health." Jackson nodded, understanding the unspoken request. "Your secret is safe with me." "Will you be there again tomorrow?" she asked, a hint of hesitation in her voice. "Yes, madam. Same time." "Then perhaps we can share our conversations with heaven," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips before she turned and walked toward the neat white building that housed Valentina's general store. Jackson watched her go, feeling for the first time since his brother's death something other than crushing grief. It wasn't happiness exactly, but a quiet recognition of shared pain that somehow made his own burden lighter. The next evening, Jackson arrived at the cemetery to find Emma already there, kneeling beside the grave with a small brush in hand, carefully cleaning the dried mud from the wooden cross. "Evening, Miss Emma," he said, removing his hat as he approached. She looked up, offering a small smile. "Mr. Lawson, I hope you don't mind. The rain last night left everything a mess." "Not at all. And please, call me Jackson." He knelt beside her, taking out his pocket knife to scrape away some stubborn clay that had hardened on the carved letters of his brother's name. "What was he like as a boy?" Emma asked suddenly. "James never spoke much about your childhood." Jackson paused, memories flooding back. Wild as a Mustang, always running headlong into trouble and somehow charming his way back out. He chuckled softly. "When he was 10, he convinced me to help him catch a rattlesnake because he wanted to make a belt. Nearly got us both killed." Emma laughed, the sound bright in the quiet cemetery. "That sounds like him. He once brought me a young eagle he'd found with a broken wing. Insisted we could nurse it back to health in my father's storeroom." "Did you?" "For 3 days, until Father discovered why the chickens were so agitated. The eagle recovered eventually, but not in our store." They shared a laugh, and Jackson realized with a start how good it felt to remember James with joy rather than just sorrow. As the sun began to set, they fell into what would become their routine, sharing stories of James, sometimes praying together, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. When darkness threatened, Jackson would walk Emma back to town, careful to part ways before reaching the more populated streets. A week passed, then 2. Their meetings became the anchor of Jackson's days as he worked at the livery stable, breaking horses and mending tack, counting the hours until he could return to the cemetery, not just to speak to his brother, but to see Emma. On a particularly warm evening in late August, they sat together on a small bench Jackson had built and placed near James's grave. "I've been wondering," Emma said, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "What will you do now? Will you stay in Randsburg?" The question caught him off guard. In truth, Jackson had given little thought to his future since James's death. Before, they had planned to save enough to buy their own ranch someday, but alone. "I hadn't decided," he admitted. "The stable work is steady, but—" He trailed off, unsure how to express the emptiness he felt when thinking beyond each day. "My father mentioned that the Henderson place is for sale," Emma said carefully. "It's not large, but it has good grazing land and a solid house." Jackson looked at her curiously. "Why would your father mention that to you?" A blush crept up Emma's neck. "He's concerned about me. He thinks I spend too much time dwelling on the past." She gestured toward the grave. "He suggested I might benefit from focusing on someone with a future." The implication hung in the air between them. Jackson felt his heartbeat quicken. "And what do you think?" he asked quietly. Emma met his gaze steadily. "I think James would not want either of us to stop living because he did." Jackson reached out, hesitantly covering her hand with his. When she didn't pull away, he felt a surge of both guilt and hope. "It feels disloyal somehow," he confessed, "to find any happiness when he's gone." "I struggle with the same feeling," Emma admitted. "But yesterday, when I told him about you helping old man Perkins with his roof repairs, I could almost hear him laughing and saying, 'About time you two figured it out.'" Jackson smiled at that. It did sound like something James would say. His brother had never been one for convention or prolonged mourning. "Would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow?" he asked suddenly. "Not here, but in town, at the hotel restaurant." The surprise in her eyes quickly gave way to warmth. "I would like that very much." The following evening marked the first time they met somewhere other than the cemetery. Jackson wore his best shirt, freshly ironed by Mrs. Carpenter at the boarding house where he stayed, and arrived at the Randsburg Hotel 15 minutes early. He paced nervously in the small lobby, nodding to acquaintances who passed by, some giving him curious looks. When Emma arrived, wearing a blue dress that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, conversations around them momentarily paused. Jackson was suddenly aware of the town's attention, of the whispers that would inevitably follow. "People are staring," Emma murmured as he led her to their table. "Let them," Jackson replied, though he felt his own discomfort. "We're not doing anything wrong." The meal passed pleasantly, their conversation flowing as easily as it had at the cemetery, though they carefully avoided mentioning James. By unspoken agreement, they kept to lighter topics: the coming Harvest Festival, a traveling theatrical company rumored to be stopping in Randsburg the following month, Emma's childhood in San Francisco before her family moved east. As Jackson walked her home afterward, they paused a block from her father's store and home. "Thank you," Emma said softly. It felt good to be among the living again. "Will your father approve?" Jackson asked, suddenly concerned about the practical realities of what was developing between them. Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "He respected you before. Everything happened, and he wants me to be happy." She hesitated, "But he may think it's too soon." "And is it?" Jackson couldn't help but ask, his voice dropping low. "Too soon?" In answer, Emma rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I want to find out." The next morning, Jackson was unsurprised to receive a summons to Valentina's general store. Emma's father, Elias Valentina, was a respected figure in Randsburg, a shrewd businessman but fair. Known for extending credit to miners down on their luck and for his generosity during tough times. The store was busy when Jackson entered, but Elias spotted him immediately and gestured toward the door behind the counter that led to the family's private rooms. "Mr. Lawson," Elias said once they were seated in a small study lined with ledgers and books, "I understand you had dinner with my daughter last night." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "With honorable intentions." Elias stroked his gray-flecked beard. "Honorable intentions toward the girl your brother was courting just 6 weeks ago." The blunt statement stung, but Jackson couldn't deny the truth in it. "I never intended for this to happen," he said honestly. "Emma and we found comfort in sharing our grief, and over time, that comfort became something more." "And my daughter? What is she to you? A replacement for what your brother lost?" "No, sir," Jackson said firmly, his hands clenching slightly. "Emma is her own person, remarkable in her own right." "I see that clearly." Elias studied him for a long moment. "My daughter has been through enough pain. I will not see her heart broken again." "I can't promise there won't be pain in life, sir," Jackson replied, "but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to bring her happiness and keep her safe." A hint of approval flickered in Elias's eyes. "You've always been the steadier of the Lawson boys. Your father was a good man, God rest his soul, and he raised you right despite the hardships." Jackson nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement. His father had died 3 years earlier after a long illness, leaving Jackson to look after James. "I don't object to your calling on Emma," Elias finally said, "but I ask that you proceed with caution and respect. The town will talk, and I won't have my daughter's reputation tarnished." "You have my word," Jackson promised. As autumn approached, Jackson and Emma settled into a new routine. They still visited James's grave, but less frequently, once a week rather than daily. Instead, they spent evenings on the Valentina's porch swing or took Sunday afternoon rides into the surrounding countryside. Jackson began making serious inquiries about the Henderson property, meeting with the bank to discuss loans. Not everyone in town approved of their relationship. Jackson occasionally caught disapproving glances or overhead muttered comments about unseemly haste or poor James barely cold in his grave. But for every critic, there seemed to be a friend who understood the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. One evening in early October, Jackson and Emma rode to a hilltop overlooking the valley as the setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. After spreading a blanket on the ground, they sat together looking out at the vista. "I received word from the bank today," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice casual. "They've approved my loan for the Henderson place." Emma turned to him, eyes wide. "Jackson, that's wonderful news." "It needs work," he cautioned. "The barn roof is in poor shape, and the fencing on the north side is practically non-existent. But the land is good, and the house is solid." "When will you take possession?" "End of the month. Mr. Henderson is eager to join his daughter in Sacramento before winter sets in." Emma was quiet for a moment, her gaze returning to the horizon. It's a lot of work for one person. Jackson took a deep breath, reaching for her hand. I was hoping. That is, I wondered if you might consider. He faltered, the carefully practiced words deserting him. A smile touched Emma's lips. Are you asking me something, Jackson Lawson? Not very well, he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. Then, finding his courage, he shifted to face her directly. Emma Valentina, I know it hasn't been long, but I love you. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Emma's eyes shimmered with tears. What will people say? They'll talk. Then they'll find something new to talk about, Jackson said firmly. All that matters is what's in our hearts. Emma raised her hand to his cheek. James brought us together, she said softly. I believe that with my whole heart. He knew we would need each other. Is that a yes? Jackson asked, hardly daring to hope. In answer, Emma leaned forward and kissed him, her lips soft against his. When she pulled back, her smile was radiant. Yes, Jackson. It's a yes. Their engagement announcement the following Sunday caused exactly the stir they had expected. Some offered sincere congratulations, others barely concealed their disapproval. Elias Valentina hosted a small dinner for them, inviting a few close friends who raised glasses in a toast that acknowledged both the joy of the moment and the unusual path that had led to it. As Jackson worked to prepare the Henderson place soon to be the Lawson ranch for their future, Emma divided her time between helping her father in the store and gathering the household items they would need. They planned a December wedding, simple but dignified, to be held in the small church in town. One crisp November morning, Jackson rode out to inspect the northern fence line of his new property. The work was progressing well. He'd hired 2 local men to help with repairs, and the main house was now watertight and solid against the coming winter. As he crested a small rise, he spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Even at a distance, Jackson recognized Sheriff Dale's distinctive silhouette. The lawman rarely ventured this far from Randsburg without cause, and Jackson felt a flicker of concern. Morning, Sheriff, he called as the older man drew near. Jackson, the sheriff nodded. Afraid I'm bringing troubling news. Jackson's mind immediately went to Emma. What's happened? Received a telegraph from the marshal in San Bernardino. Billy Riker escaped from custody 3 days ago. The name hit Jackson like a physical blow. Billy Riker, the gambler who had shot James during a dispute over cards, the man who had been awaiting trial for murder. They think he's headed this way? Sheriff Dale nodded grimly. He was heard making threats before he escaped, said he had unfinished business in Randsburg. Jackson's jaw tightened. Me? Possibly. Or anyone connected to the case against him. The sheriff paused. Including Miss Valentina. Her testimony about what she witnessed that night is crucial. Cold fear replaced shock. Emma had been at the saloon that fateful evening, having gone to meet James after closing the store. She had seen the argument escalate, had watched helplessly as Riker drew his gun and fired before James could react. I need to get back to town, Jackson said, already turning his horse. That's why I came to find you, the sheriff agreed. I've deputized 2 men to keep watch, but I'd feel better if you were nearby. They rode hard back to Randsburg, dust billowing behind them. Jackson's mind raced with scenarios, each more alarming than the last. By the time they reached town, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool air. Emma was safe at the store when they arrived, though visibly shaken by the news. I'm not afraid for myself, she insisted, as Jackson and her father conferred in the back room. But I won't have anyone else hurt because of that man. No one's getting hurt, Jackson assured her, though the weight of his holstered revolver seemed suddenly heavier against his hip. The sheriff has men watching all approaches to town. Riker won't get within a mile of Randsburg without being spotted. But as 3 days passed with no sign of the escaped prisoner, tension began to give way to routine. Jackson divided his time between the ranch and town, unwilling to stray far from Emma, but equally determined not to let fear disrupt their lives completely. On the fourth day, a driving rain swept through the valley, turning roads to mud and reducing visibility to mere yards. Jackson spent the morning at the ranch, securing loose items against the wind, then rode into town despite the miserable conditions. The streets were largely deserted as he made his way to the general store, people having sought shelter from the downpour. Inside, he found Emma alone, reorganizing shelves while her father made deliveries to elderly customers who couldn't venture out in such weather. "You're soaked through," she scolded, immediately fetching a towel from beneath the counter. Jackson accepted it gratefully, wiping rain from his face. "Thought I'd escort you and your father to dinner at the hotel tonight. No sense cooking in weather like this." Emma smiled, touching his hand. "Always my protector. Father should be back within the hour, and I'm sure he'll appreciate the invitation." A flash of lightning illuminated the store, followed by a crack of thunder that rattled the windows. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with renewed fury. "I should check that the back door is secured," Emma said, moving toward the storeroom. "Last time it rained this hard, water came right under—" The front door burst open, bringing with it a gust of wind and rain, and a figure Jackson recognized instantly despite the sodden hat pulled low over his face. Billy Riker stepped inside, water streaming from his duster, a revolver already in his hand. "Well now," he drawled, his voice carrying over the storm's noise. "Ain't this convenient? 2 birds with 1 stone." Jackson instinctively shifted, putting himself between Emma and the gunman. His own weapon was within reach, but any move toward it would likely get him shot before he could draw. "Riker," he acknowledged, keeping his voice level, "the marshal's already on your trail. You won't get far in this weather." The gunman's laugh held no humor. "Far enough to settle accounts. Your brother cheated me, Lawson, and this little lady's lies would have seen me hang." He gestured with his gun. "Both of you, move to the back, nice and slow." Jackson felt Emma's hand on his arm, a silent communication. They had discussed what to do if Riker appeared. Stay calm, follow instructions, wait for an opportunity. Sheriff Dale had assured them that Riker wanted to escape more than he wanted revenge, that he was likely to be captured before reaching Randsburg. They had been wrong. As they backed toward the storeroom, Jackson's mind worked furiously. The rear door that Emma had mentioned, did it offer any chance of escape? Or were they simply being moved out of sight to where gunshots wouldn't immediately draw attention? "James didn't cheat you," Emma said suddenly, her voice surprisingly steady. "You lost fairly, and you couldn't accept it." Riker's face darkened. "Shut your mouth, woman." "Emma," Jackson warned quietly, but she continued. "Everyone in the saloon saw what happened. You accused him without proof, and when he defended his honor, you shot him before he could even reach for his gun." Jackson realized what she was doing, keeping Riker's attention on her while they moved deeper into the store, closer to potential weapons or escape routes. But it was a dangerous game. "I said shut up," Riker snarled, advancing. "I ain't going to hang because some uppity storekeeper's daughter wanted to play witness." They had reached the storeroom now, a large space filled with crates, barrels, and shelves of inventory. Rain pounded on the small windows set high in the walls, and a rear door led to the loading area behind the store. Jackson's eyes darted around, assessing possibilities. A stack of crates to their left might provide cover. Tools hung on the wall to their right, a hammer, a pry bar. Not ideal against a gun, but better than nothing. "You won't hang for James," Jackson said, drawing Riker's attention back to himself. "But if you harm either of us, there won't be a place in this territory where you can hide." Something shifted in Riker's eyes, calculation replacing anger. "Maybe I just need to make sure the lady can't testify. Nothing personal, you understand, just business?" He raised his gun, aiming at Emma, and Jackson didn't think he moved, lunging forward with a shout as Emma ducked sideways. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, the bullet splintering wood somewhere behind them as Jackson collided with Riker, driving him backward. They crashed into a shelf, sending goods tumbling. Jackson grappled for the gun, managing to knock it from Riker's hand, but the man was strong and desperate. A fist connected with Jackson's jaw, sending him staggering. Riker scrambled for his fallen weapon. Jackson launched himself forward again, tackling him to the floor where they rolled, trading blows. Through the haze of combat, Jackson heard Emma cry out, but couldn't spare a glance to see if she was hurt or simply afraid. A knee drove into Jackson's stomach, forcing the air from his lungs. As he gasped, Riker broke free, surging toward his gun which had slid beneath a low shelf. Then Emma was there. The heavy iron pry bar in her hands, she swung it with all her strength, connecting with Riker's outstretched arm. The crack of breaking bone was followed by a howl of pain as Riker clutched his shattered limb. Jackson staggered to his feet, blood trickling from a split lip. Before Riker could recover, he delivered a powerful blow to the man's jaw, sending him crashing to the floor, unconscious. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the continuing downpour outside. Then, Emma dropped the pry bar with a clatter, her hands shaking as the reality of what had happened sank in. Jackson quickly retrieved Riker's gun, tucking it into his belt, then pulled a length of rope from a nearby shelf to bind the unconscious man's hands and feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked Emma, his voice hoarse with concern. She shook her head, though her face was pale. "No, but you're bleeding." Jackson touched his lip, wincing. "It's nothing. We need to get the sheriff." As if summoned by his words, the front bell jingled, followed by Elias Valentina's worried call. "Emma, are you all right? I saw the door standing open in this downpour." "Back here, Father," Emma called, her voice breaking slightly. "We're safe now." Within minutes, the store was filled with activity. Sheriff Dale and his deputies took custody of the still unconscious Riker, while Dr. Matthews examined Jackson's injuries, pronouncing them minor, but insisting on cleaning the cuts properly. Emma stayed close to Jackson throughout, her initial shock giving way to a fierce protectiveness that surprised even her father. When the doctor suggested Jackson remain in town overnight for observation due to a possible concussion, it was Emma who insisted he stay in their guest room rather than return to his boarding house. "You're not leaving my sight," she told him firmly, as she helped him into the comfortable chair in the Valentina's sitting room later that evening. "Not after what happened today." Jackson smiled despite his aching jaw. "I think I was supposed to be protecting you, not the other way around." Emma's expression softened as she knelt beside his chair. "We protected each other. That's what partners do." Elias, watching from the doorway, cleared his throat. "I think perhaps we should consider moving the wedding date forward," he suggested. "After today's events, waiting until December seems unnecessarily cautious." Jackson looked from father to daughter, surprise giving way to hope. "If Emma agrees." Emma's eyes shone as she took his hand. "Next Sunday," she decided, "if the minister is available." And so it was that on a clear, crisp November morning, just 10 days after Billy Riker's recapture and swift return to a more secure prison, Jackson Lawson and Emma Valentina were married in the Randsburg church. The simple ceremony was attended by most of the town. Even those who had initially disapproved seemed to have reconsidered after the dramatic confrontation at the store. As they exchanged vows, Jackson couldn't help but think of his brother. James should have been standing beside him as best man, should have been grinning and slapping him on the back afterward. The pang of loss was still there, but no longer overwhelming. Somehow he knew James would approve. After the ceremony, before joining their guests for the celebration at the hotel, Jackson and Emma made a brief private visit to the cemetery. They stood hand in hand before James's grave, now marked with a proper headstone rather than the wooden cross. "We wanted you to be the first to know officially," Jackson said softly, his voice catching slightly. "Though I reckon you've been watching all along." Emma placed her small wedding bouquet at the base of the stone. "Thank you for bringing us together," she whispered. "We'll make you proud, I promise." As they turned to leave, the setting sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the cemetery. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers on the grave, and for just a moment, Jackson would have sworn he heard his brother's laughing voice on the wind. About time. 6 months later, the Lawson ranch was transformed. The house gleamed with fresh paint, the barn sported a new roof, and the corrals held a small but growing herd of quality cattle. Inside the house, Emma had created a warm, welcoming home with a combination of pieces brought from her father's house and items they had selected together. On a perfect spring evening, they sat on their front porch swing, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Emma's head rested comfortably against Jackson's shoulder, her hand absently stroking her slightly rounded belly. The baby wasn't showing much yet, but the doctor had confirmed their suspicions the previous week. "What do you think of the name James if it's a boy?" Emma asked softly. Jackson smiled, covering her hand with his own. "I'd like that. And if it's a girl?" Emma considered for a moment. "Josephine, perhaps? We could call her Josie." "Josephine Lawson," Jackson tested the name. "It has a nice sound to it." They sat in companionable silence as darkness slowly claimed the land. Stars began to appear overhead, bright pinpoints in the vast sky. "Do you still talk to him?" Emma asked suddenly. Jackson knew immediately whom she meant. "Sometimes. When I'm working the north pasture alone, or when something happens that I wish I could share with him." He paused. "Do you?" Emma nodded against his shoulder. "Especially since we learned about the baby. I want to tell him he's going to be an uncle." Jackson tightened his arm around her. "I think he knows." As if in confirmation, a shooting star streaked across the darkening sky, leaving a brief, brilliant trail. "See?" Emma laughed softly. "He's showing off." Jackson chuckled. "That sounds like Jamie." The ranch continued to prosper as the seasons turned. In December, Emma gave birth to a healthy son whom they named James Elias Lawson. The boy had his father's dark hair but his mother's thoughtful eyes, and from his earliest days showed a determination that reminded everyone of his namesake uncle. Little James was joined 2 years later by a sister, Josephine, who arrived during a summer thunderstorm with a wail that, according to the midwife, could be heard clear to the next county. Where James was thoughtful and deliberate, Josie was all energy and laughter, running before she could properly walk, climbing everything in sight. Through the years, the ritual remained. On the anniversary of James's death, Jackson and Emma would visit the cemetery together, bringing their children when they were old enough to understand. They would place flowers, say a prayer, and share stories of the uncle the children would never know, but whose spirit seemed to live on in their family. 10 years after Jackson and Emma's wedding, Randsburg had grown considerably. The railroad had finally reached the town, bringing new opportunities and connections to the wider world. Elias Valentina had semi-retired, turning much of the store's operation over to his trusted manager, while he doted on his grandchildren. On a warm autumn afternoon, 12-year-old James raced into the ranch house, excitement written across his face. "Pa! There's a man at the door says he's looking for Jackson Lawson." Jackson looked up from the accounts he was reviewing at the kitchen table. "Did he give a name, son?" "Said his name's Thomas Lawson. Says he's your cousin from back east." Jackson frowned, setting aside his pencil. The name stirred vague memories his father had mentioned cousins in Pennsylvania, but the families had lost touch decades ago. Rising, he followed his son to the door where a well-dressed man in his 30s stood waiting, hat in hand. The family resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, something about the set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes. "Jackson Lawson?" the man asked. "I'm Thomas Lawson, son of your father's brother William. I've been trying to locate you for nearly a year." Jackson extended his hand, curiosity overcoming surprise. "Come in, cousin. This is unexpected, but welcome." As Emma prepared coffee, Thomas explained his presence. "My father passed last winter. While settling his affairs, I found correspondence with your father from many years ago, and more recently, newspaper clippings about events in Randsburg." He hesitated. "Including an account of your brother James's death and the trial of his killer." A shadow crossed Jackson's face at the mention, though the pain had dulled with time. "I'm sorry about your father. Did you know him well?" Thomas nodded. "Very well, which is why his final request surprised me so much." He reached into his coat, withdrawing an envelope. He asked me to find you, to deliver this personally, and to make amends for a wrong done long ago. Puzzled, Jackson accepted the envelope. Inside was a letter written in a shaky hand, dated shortly before William Lawson's death. As Jackson read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "What is it?" Emma asked softly, noting the change. "My Uncle William. He claims he was responsible for my father leaving Pennsylvania." Jackson looked up at Thomas. "Is this true?" Thomas nodded gravely. "Father confessed everything to me before he died. Your father was engaged to be married to my mother, Sarah. But father was in love with her too. He fabricated evidence that your father had been unfaithful, presented it to Sarah, who broke the engagement. Your father, heartbroken and disgraced, headed west. By the time the truth came out, he had disappeared." "And my mother, Margaret?" Jackson asked, still processing this revelation. "Father tried to find your dad, to make amends. He finally located him in California years later, learned he had married and had 2 sons. But pride kept him from reaching out directly." Thomas hesitated. "The rest is in the letter, including the reason for my visit." Jackson returned to the pages, reading aloud for Emma's benefit. "And so I ask your forgiveness, though I deserved none. Your father built a new life despite my betrayal, and from what I gather, raised fine sons. Before I meet my maker, I wish to make what amends I can. Enclosed you will find documentation transferring ownership of the Lawson Mining Company to your family. It has prospered over the years under my stewardship, but rightfully belongs to my brother's heirs. Thomas will explain the details." Jackson looked up, stunned. "Mining company?" Thomas nodded. "Father started it after striking silver in Nevada in '65. It's grown considerably, operations in 3 states now. Father always considered half of it rightfully yours, kept detailed records of what would have been your father's share." He produced another document from his case. "This makes you and any surviving kin of your father equal partners in the enterprise. It's substantial, cousin." Emma sat heavily in a nearby chair. "How substantial?" Thomas named a figure that made both Lawsons stare in disbelief. "That can't be right," Jackson managed. "I assure you it is," Thomas replied. "Father was many things, but he was meticulous in business. The company is solid, the profits genuine." "I don't know what to say," Jackson admitted, looking to Emma, who appeared equally overwhelmed. "Say you'll consider the offer," Thomas suggested gently. "Take time to digest this. I'm staying in town for a week at the hotel. We can discuss options, your level of involvement. The company runs itself in many ways, but having a Lawson from your father's line involved would mean a great deal." Later that night, after Thomas had returned to town and the children were asleep, Jackson and Emma sat before the fireplace, still processing the day's revelations. "What are you thinking?" Emma asked, watching her husband's thoughtful expression. "That James would find this hilarious," Jackson replied with a small smile. "All those years we scraped and saved, dreaming of our own place, and now this falls into our laps." Emma squeezed his hand. "What do you want to do?" Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to leave the ranch. We built this together. It's our home. But this inheritance, it could secure the children's future. James could attend university if he wants. Josie too. And the company?" Thomas seemed eager for your involvement. "I'm no businessman," Jackson admitted, "but I could learn. Maybe divide my time with a manager handling daily operations here when I'm away." He looked at her searchingly. "What do you want, Emma?" She considered before answering. "I want our children to have choices we didn't have, but I don't want them or us to forget who we are and where we came from." She smiled softly. "I think we should accept, but on our terms. This is still our home, our life. The money is a tool, not a destination." Jackson nodded, feeling the rightness of her words. "Tomorrow I'll ride out to the cemetery, tell James about all this. Seems only fair he should be the first to know." Emma's eyes shimmered with understanding. "I'll come with you." The next morning dawned clear and bright. They rode together to the cemetery, now considerably expanded as Randsburg had grown. James's grave remained well tended, the headstone weathered but dignified. As had become their tradition, they sat together on the bench Jackson had built so many years before, now replaced twice as the original had succumbed to the elements. "Well, Jamie," Jackson began, his voice steady and warm, "you won't believe what's happened now." He recounted the story, occasionally glancing at Emma for confirmation or elaboration. The spring breeze ruffled the wild flowers Emma had placed on the grave, carrying the scent of sage and new growth. When he finished, Jackson fell silent for a moment before adding softly, "I wish you were here to see all this, brother, to know my children, to share in this unexpected turn." "You're not the only one talking to heaven," Emma said, echoing the words she had spoken so many years before, when they first met in this very spot. "I think somehow he knows. He's been watching over us all along." Jackson nodded, reaching for her hand. Their fingers intertwined, familiar and comforting after years of partnership. From that first meeting in grief, they had built a life filled with love, purpose, and now, unexpected abundance. "What comes next is for the living," Jackson said, rising and helping Emma to her feet. "But we won't forget who helped us find each other." They stood a moment longer before the grave, paying silent respect to the man whose absence had brought them together, whose memory had become not a shadow over their happiness, but a foundation beneath it. As they turned to leave, to return to their children and the new chapter of their lives, a meadowlark called from a nearby tree, its clear, sweet song filling the morning air. Emma smiled, squeezing Jackson's hand. "He approves," she said simply. Jackson nodded, his heart full. He always did. Hand in hand they walked back to their horses, leaving the cemetery but carrying with them the blessings of those who had gone before, the promise of the future stretching bright before them. In the years that followed, the Lawson name became known throughout the West, not just for the mining company that flourished under the joint stewardship of the reunited family branches, but for the ranch that remained Jackson and Emma's true home. James Elias Lawson grew into a thoughtful young man who combined business acumen with his father's integrity, eventually taking over the western operations of Lawson Mining while maintaining the ranch his parents had built. Josephine, spirited and independent, surprised everyone by developing a keen interest in medicine, becoming one of the first female doctors to practice in California. Through all the changes, prosperity, and occasional hardships that life inevitably brings, Jackson and Emma maintained their tradition of visits to the cemetery, their conversations with heaven. And though decades passed and their own hair turned silver, they never forgot that their story began with shared grief, transformed by grace and courage, into a love that sustained them through all of life's seasons. When asked by their grandchildren how they had met, they would share the full story, unvarnished of loss and healing, of a chance encounter at a graveside, of words spoken to heaven and heard by hearts open to new beginnings. It was, they knew, an unusual foundation for a marriage, but one that had proved as solid and enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel over their beloved ranch, their home, their life together.